let's dive right in, and I'd like to introduce you to Andy DeSantis. Andy is a private practice dietitian and 11-time published author with a master's in public health nutrition. He's worked with Diabetes Canada, been featured on CTV's The Social, as well as the Dose podcast on CBC with Dr. Brian Goldman. He creates global online content to complement his one-on-one client work. Through writing and social media, Andy blends his expertise and accessibility to make nutrition advice truly impactful. Please join me in welcoming Andy DeSantis.
Without further ado, we're going to go through, let's start with the title of the presentation, which is the Ozempic effect, nutrition, weight loss, and athletic performance. And we'll see from today's agenda that we are going to cover a lot of topics in this realm. So I just want to go through the agenda, and these topics will mix and match with each other. They won't necessarily be presented chronologically, but these are some of the things we're going to talk about. I mean, I'm going to offer a little bit of introduction to myself and give you a touch of case study in my private practice around Ozempic use, semaglutide use. We're going to look at some actual data about the use of this medication in Canada, what it looks like, what the magnitude is, the reasons for use, although many of us, can speculate as to what those are. We're going to talk a little bit about the actual mechanism of action. So what this medication is actually doing in the body, just to simplify and enhance our understanding for ourselves, and also should we need to discuss it with the client who maybe doesn't have the same level of health or scientific comprehension as we might. Also going to cover Ozempic's influence on muscle, bone, and metabolic health. And metabolic health is kind of an umbrella term that I use to really refer to things like blood sugar management, fatty liver disease, these things that really, blood cholesterol and so on, these aspects which fall under what I consider the metabolic health umbrella. And I mean, the fun part, I suppose, today is that this is the area I work in a lot. So one of the things I'm going to try to offer to the best of my ability is insights as a private practice dietitian who sees a fair number of clients using these medications, how I look at it from my responsibilities and how it might change my responsibilities in providing client guidance, or whether it really does change it all that much. And so that will be an interesting question we'll explore as well. We'll definitely discuss the synergy between Ozempic and physical activity, and suffice to say, there's a massive synergy, which means that they're better together. Okay. Now, before we get to all of that, again, I want to offer a little bit of introduction to myself. So at this current point in time in my private practice, I spend a lot of time looking at fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, blood sugar management, and from the metabolic health side, Ozempic use, there's frequent Ozempic use for goals in that area, right? Of course, and we're going to see the data shortly, but above and beyond that, of course, there is use for the explicit goals around weight loss too. Now, the thing with this medication, as it emerges, it's been emerging more and more the last several years. We hear about it more and more. More studies are constantly coming out, and of course, in and amongst all the data, which we will go through a lot today, you're gonna hear, and you have heard in your own personal lives, a lot of anecdotes, right? Different cases of clients who've had success or of lack of success. So I want to offer, two sides of that coin, right? So on the one side, and again, this is let's say a curated story. So not a precise, not an exact client story, but more or less what's happened in people I've seen. So on the one side, you'll have the individual who has, worked with me for an extended period, put great effort into bringing to life my nutrition guidance, but maybe for that given individual, they haven't had the success they might have hoped for. So in collaboration with their medical team, they may decide to pursue the use of certain medications. And then you see actually their initial endeavor and hard work in terms of understanding nutrition is better rewarded in that context. And so that is like, and that's like an optimistic pathway, let's say. And I have to say a few other things about my role as a dietitian and this medication as well. So that's one. The other individual, let's say the more of the worst case scenario, the gastrointestinal symptoms are too severe and they lose interest within the first few weeks or the first month or two, right? So those are the kind of different ends of the spectrum you might see. And of course, there is everything in between. So I am coming at today's presentation from the perspective of a dietitian, of a nutrition professional. There are different concentric circles that one can look at this medication from the pharmacy perspective, from the doctor, the medical side. I'm obviously going to present it from the dietitian side and obviously the fitness side as well. So that will be where my focus is. So with that said, I pulled a few quotes. There was a relatively, let's say, famous data collection done by Dalhousie University about Ozempic use in Canada. And what they determined in this particular survey is that about 10% of the adult population in Canada uses GLP-1 type medications like Ozempic. And that ends up being up to 1.4 million people in the country. So right now, in terms of numbers of use, in terms of best estimates in Canada, we're looking at 1 in 10. I believe in the United States, the numbers I've seen, and they're inevitably, because there's more resources there for collection of data, inevitably there is better data of the United States. It might be closer to 1 in 8 adults at this point in time are using GLP-1 medications. And I'm also going to define what that term means for shortly. So you'll see here from this chart, again, this is from the Dalhousie University survey, that over 50% of people currently using Ozempic, semaglutide, is for type 2 diabetes, whereas around a quarter is for weight loss, and then a smaller fraction is explicitly for both. So it's pretty clear that I suppose the main outcomes of interest when we were talking about Ozempic use is A1C lowering, which A1C, for those who don't know, is a metric of blood sugar management, and weight loss. So those are going to be the things that we're going to be quite curious about, in today's presentation, and then more broadly in our clients who might be using this medication. So in terms of the actual raw numbers, and again, we are going to jump around a little bit. We're going to share some fun facts. But in terms of the raw numbers, we can see here that depending on the dosage, Ozempic use can actually lead to up to a 2.1% reduction in A1C, okay? With the ultimate goal generally being, if someone has type 2 diabetes, to reach an A1C below 7, although the lower we can get it, the better. And from the diet and lifestyle perspective, as a comparable point, we know that lifestyle and diet changes can reduce A1C an additional 1 to 2%. Now, what I want to add here is that this is not a hard and fast ceiling, nor am I trying to favorably compare Ozempic to diet and exercise. Obviously, I am a dietitian, and my first and foremost priority is nutrition management with my clients. But this is just a good objective look at the data. Individual experiences, it goes without saying, will vary. We probably all have that client experience who their A1C was 8, 9, and we brought it down to 5, 6, 7, collaborative work. So I'm not trying to make a universal statement here, but this is just a glimpse at the actual data and what the science is telling us at this point in time. So I also want to discuss my area of specialty, which is fatty liver disease, briefly. So I've put together a few studies here, and I kind of want to set the stage before we go into the introductory points about GLP-1s, just to kind of get a sense of what is it that we're contending with, okay? So for those who don't know, fatty liver disease is extremely common right now. It affects 1 in 3 adults in North America. So it's a pervasive topic. So what I have here are 4 studies of great interest to me as someone who spends a lot of time in this area, and we're going to tie it into why that is related to Ozempic and the potential, let's say, of Ozempic and GLP-1 medications. So in the top left corner, we have a prolonged nutrition trial. And what this trial found was that a high polyphenol Mediterranean diet, which is something that perhaps a full discussion for another day, but just to say that is the style of eating they pursued, led to a nearly 40% reduction in liver fat content. Okay, so keep that number in mind. 40% reduction in liver fat content over 18 months with a high polyphenol Mediterranean diet. Okay, which is a very specific curated style of eating, by the way. Then we have on the upper right, okay, we have an aggregation of data from the Australian Exercise and Sports Science Association looking at physical activity and the effect on liver fat. And what they found is that around 150 minutes or more per week of either cardiovascular or resistance training, but particularly cardiovascular training. So, I mean, today there's going to be an interesting discussion and back and forth today between the effects of aerobic workouts and resistance training workouts in terms of what's been studied in the world of GLP-1s, what might be more advisable in the world of GLP-1s. But for fatty liver specifically, aerobic activity gets a slight edge, and that's bonus knowledge for anyone. And what they found is you can expect a 30% or more decrease in liver fat content over an extended period of time, exercising 150 minutes or more per week. So we have around 39%, 40%, we have 30%. And then we go to the bottom most right study, which looked at an aggregate of studies using GLP-1s as it relates to liver fat content. What they found is that people who use GLP-1s for at least 6 months or longer, the average liver fat loss is 26.6%. So that's a meaningful number, but as we can see, it's not quite the same number as diet and exercise. And, to the extent to which that point is super important or not, hard to say at this point in history, in its history of use for fatty liver disease. But I wanted to show you that the magnitude of effect of the GLP-1s doesn't blow exercise and diet out of the water. Okay. And I actually have an interesting challenge today, which is to objectively present information on Ozempic, well, inherently being a professional who obviously believes in a food first approach and, believes on the power of food. And hopefully I'm going to do a good job of doing that. So hopefully all equally we can appreciate that slight challenge. But I also want to share one more study in this world. So in the bottom left corner, we have phase 3 trial of semaglutide and metabolic dysfunction associates steatohepatitis. Fancy scientific word for NASH, which is the advanced form of fatty liver disease. And what this study showed is that Ozempic use was actually able to reduce liver fibrosis or liver scarring. So anyone who has had clients who have this condition, which is increasingly common, which is why I'm taking time to discuss it, there is brand new evidence, literally just came out. You can see April 30th, 2025, that for some people, Ozempic actually can reduce liver fibrosis. In this study, it also led to reductions in A1C, of course, reductions in LDL, increases in HDL, which is good cholesterol, reduction in triglycerides. So it does meaningfully contribute to all of these markers. Okay, so that is objectively true. Now we can talk about, now we're going to go from some advanced stuff to like the introductory stuff, and we're going to get the story started. Okay, so let's start. Again, we hear this word GLP-1 a lot. So let's actually just define what that is. All right, so GLP-1 is a hormone and it's produced by cells called L cells that are primarily found in your intestines, mostly in your small intestines. And what they do is they detect essentially the macronutrients, carbs, fat, and protein, these L cells, and they release the GLP-1 hormone in response. Now, the GLP-1 hormone can act on all sorts of parts in the human body, but most of the receptors, or certainly the majority of the receptors, are found in the brain and the pancreas. Okay, the GLP-1 hormone, and we're gonna find out what the consequences of that binding is. But the GLP-1 hormone binds those receptors, and then it leads to a cascade of benefits and effects and influences on our physiology, our appetite, and so on. Now, where does Ozempic come into the picture? Well, what Ozempic is, what semaglutide is basically a 94% structural equivalent of GLP-1. So it's close enough to GLP-1 that our body allows it to bind to the same places that it will allow the naturally occurring GLP-1 hormone that our L cells create to. Okay, so yeah, that's all we have to say. So a fun fact, those who may not know, it's 94% structural resemblance, and that is why Ozempic is able to replicate the effect of the hormone in the human body. On the leftmost side, that fancy 3D diagram is what the actual GLP-1 hormone looks like in the science world. Okay, so now I just finished saying that GLP-1 receptors are disproportionately found in the brain and the pancreas. Okay, so what GLP-1 does in the pancreas is it promotes the release of insulin, okay, and it also increases the beta cells' sensitivity to releasing insulin. So the beta cells of the pancreas are what is responsible for releasing insulin. That's something we may have heard of before. But when we talk about topics like insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity, part of the reason why GLP-1 medications help with that and ultimately help to lower blood sugar levels, it's not just about appetite suppression. It's not just about slowing stomach emptying, which we will discuss, but GLP-1 medications actually act on the pancreas, right? And insulin signaling. So as such, right, their effect on the body, their physiological effect includes a positive influence on insulin sensitivity and on insulin resistance. So I want to share that. From there, we talk about the brain, okay? So this is a bit of an overly fancy scientific synopsis here, but basically what this is saying is that there are a lot of GLP-1 receptors in the part of the brain that is known to control appetite and food behaviors. That's called the hypothalamus, okay? So what this little synopsis is essentially saying is the GLP-1 hormones are able to bind to this part of the brain, and subsequently this region of the brain, the hypothalamus, is more likely to release hormones that make us feel full, which is anorexigenic, rather than hormones that make us feel more hungry, which is orexigenic. Okay, so these are fancy scientific terms. We don't need to worry about it too much beyond that. Another reason why, beyond just, slowing down our stomach, is that this GLP-1 medications bind to a part of the brain which is known to influence our appetite. Okay, so there's an effect going on there. Now, I want to give another example about just how powerful this region of the brain is to try and offer some scientific infusion here. Okay, so in this study, what the scientists did is they essentially exposed people to the amount of cortisol. So in this case, glucocorticoids is just a fancy term again for cortisol, the stress hormone. They exposed people to the amount of cortisol that would replicate a stressful situation in real life. And what they found is blood flow to the hypothalamus was decreased. Okay, so remember, and also obviously stress interferes with our choices and our hunger levels, right? Obviously we kind of all have a sense that stress influences our hunger and our food choice. Now, one of the reasons why it's very likely, as these scientists found out, is because it decreases blood flow to the hypothalamus, the same part of the same region that we know is responsible for appetite control. So this is more a fun fact than anything else. And in case you want to share this with clients or colleagues, I thought it might be a fun one. So this just offers some actual scientific understanding as to why stress influences our eating behaviors. Okay, and why also perhaps I think it could be fair to say why even in the context of, let's say, a very stressed person, I mean, Ozempic could still have some sort of have a positive effect because it does interact with those same brain regions that are affected. That's a massive oversimplification, so I'm not going to put too much value in that. Just want to say it. Okay, I want to offer one more insight into this area. Okay, talking about, because we are talking today, or I did talk about cortisol regulation in terms of how that is related to the hypothalamus eating behavior, and we are talking about blood sugar a lot because that's what Ozempic is involved in. So I just wanted to throw this out there for those who want to balance the medical side, the pharmaceutical side with natural solutions. So it's a really fascinating study that found that when women with type 2 included deep breathing and meditation on top of physical activity, they received additional reductions to blood sugar and cortisol levels as compared to physical activity alone. So I thought that was a fun finding that was connected to what I just said. So I put it in there. Okay, so back to Ozempic. So perhaps the most famous and well-known mechanism of Ozempic in the body is that it delays, again, fancy terms, delays gastric emptying, just means your stomach empties rather more slowly. Okay, there are GLP-1 receptors throughout the digestive tract. Okay, and there's a valve that connects the stomach with the small intestine. Okay, the GLP-1 medication causes that valve to relax, okay, and also to contract, and it causes the whole of the stomach to contract more slowly. When you put those two things together, food starts to move through your system much more slowly, which leads to a healthier blood sugar response. And when I'm speaking with clients about this, I like to use a hole in a ship analogy. If you have a big boat, big ship, there's a massive leak in it, well, that ship is probably going to go down relatively quickly. But if there's a small little leak, theoretically, let's say the ship hands can constantly get it and get rid of it, right? So that's a healthy blood sugar response versus a really, big spike in blood sugar levels. And there's many different ways, of course, we can manipulate the body to get that favorable response. Like we can eat more slowly, we can eat our carbohydrates last at the meal, right? We can do all sorts of fun things, but Ozempic does this, I suppose, without us. I won't say without us needing to do those things, but offers a way for these things to occur without, let's say, other aspects being checked off. Okay. Now, of course, to offer some fun balance, I want to bring this up because you'll see a lot online about, oh, is there like a GLP-1 diet? Can we just eat certain foods to stimulate GLP-1 production like Ozempic? And I mean, I think fundamentally it's the case that food and pharmaceuticals, well, they may have overlap in the systems that they work with. I mean, the magnitude of their effect is quite different. But I did want to share the following: is that, okay, monounsaturated fats, which are found in nuts, avocado, and olive oil. And now this is actually going to be connected to the broader topic today, because one of the things, of course, that happens, as we all know with Ozempic, as appetite decreases, food intake decreases. And now we have a challenge on our hands to ensure that we optimize an individual's diet in the context of less appetite and less calories. So I offer this. And now sometimes for some people, fats can be the first thing to go. And obviously I don't advocate for that. But what scientists have found is that monounsaturated fats may have an above average ability to stimulate GLP-1 release from the L cells. So remember earlier I said that the L cells in the small intestines are what release the GLP-1 hormone in response to macronutrients. But that's not to say that all macronutrients induce the same response. So scientists believe that monounsaturated fats may have an above average ability to reduce GLP-1, which may be one of the many reasons that we also see that monounsaturated fats actually have a positive influence on insulin resistance and on liver fat levels. Okay. So I want to make that little fun tie in there again, just to offer a balanced view of this topic. Okay, so hopefully everyone enjoyed that aspect. Now we're going to talk about some numbers and some of the more famous trials looking at semaglutide, which is Ozempic or similar medications in terms of the raw outputs, in terms of the benefits. Okay, so in this trial, the SELECT trial, over 17,000 adults were present. So in this particular study, this was not a trial looking at people with diabetes. Okay, this is a trial looking at people who had BMI above the obesity threshold. Okay, what they found is, right, from the health perspective, 20% reduction in, adverse cardiovascular events, hospitalization, and, and worse, right? And that the weight loss that was experienced on this medication, okay, over a 65-week period was continued over 4 years. So whatever weight they were able to lose in the first year and a bit, they actually were able to continue beyond that while being on the medication. And the actual output of the weight loss was around 10%, which is the average weight reduction. So that what that really means is some people would have lost less, some people would have lost more, but on the average, people lost about 10% of their body weight over a 208-week period. So that's 4 years, a fun way to say 4 years. And they lost about 8 centimeters of around their waist circumference. So this is with semaglutide, Ozempic in people without diabetes. So that is the magnitude of change that we're looking at. Now, I'm going to talk about some more trials. And the reality is there are different iterations of these medications, which for some populations can lead to bigger weight loss. But some studies, so you may have seen a different study that shows a different magnitude of weight loss, but then there are going to be questions as to how many people were in the study, which medication was used, and so on. But alas, we are going to discuss some more now. Okay. Now, one of the big questions that we have to talk about, and I could have talked about it at any point, but I want to talk about it right now, is the cost benefit analysis. Okay. So there's a lot of fancy data on this page. But what this really means is the following. Okay. I'm going to go through it one by one and we're going to speak more broadly. So this was a pretty cool study that was done out of a very reputable journal out of Lancet. Okay. And what they tried to offer is some insight as to are the costs of Ozempic use, specifically over a 2-year period, because we don't necessarily have robust data to really make a high-level claim about what Ozempic use might do in 10, 15, 20 years in large populations of people using it for different purposes. But we're going to look at it from the 2-year perspective, okay? So we see that per 1,000 people using the medication, these are some of the consequences that you could experience, right? So 41 in 1,000 over a 2-year period experienced abdominal pain. Cholelithiasis, I probably mispronounce it as gallstones, because that can occur in rapid weight loss for those who don't know. Okay, constipation occurred in 118 per 1,000 people, diarrhea in 100. So we can see right away, okay, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, abdominal pain. It probably won't surprise anyone to see here that the majority of the unfavorable outcomes do relate to gastrointestinal symptoms. We have alopecia, which is hair loss occurring in 57 people, injection site reactions in a relatively small number, 4 per 1,000, hypoglycemia, which is just a fancy way to say low blood sugar, occurring in 17 of 1,000 people. Okay, so that's the first aspect of it. Okay, now what they then went on to claim is that if an individual has a goal to lose 10% of their body weight in over a 2-year period, that the majority of people, the achievement of this outcome, right, outweighed the totality of the negative symptoms and the negative consequences, right? So over a 2-year period specifically, there's a very high success rate for semaglutide, particularly. Now, when we go down to the bottommost point, you'll see that different medications, that becomes less the case as per the data they looked at, right? So there are different medications like Mounjaro and so on, which have another component in them but which may, as a result, entail more side effects, right? So the cost-benefit analysis, when you move away from semaglutide to the other medications, it starts to go down a little bit because the likelihood of symptoms goes up higher. And that's based on current available evidence. So essentially, what this is saying is that there is a sense that, the majority of people for a 2-year period are experiencing the benefit they want to experience, and that the harms that they're experiencing are tolerable to them over that 2-year period. Okay. And again, this is an aggregation of a lot of data. That's not to say that we all know someone for whom this is not true, right? Where they had a bad experience and these symptoms were too much. And that's kind of the point I was trying to get across at the beginning. And actually, I'm going to pause this for a moment. More broadly speaking, as much as all the data is valuable, there's no getting away from the fact that it's the individual experience, right? And curating the individual experience that is the most important aspect of success, let's say success or failure with this medication. And I'll come back to that more soon. Okay. So now, of course, we have to talk about, or I'd like to talk about symptom management. Now, why is it important to talk about symptom management? Well, here's the thing, right? Title of this presentation is around Ozempic for athletic performance, energy levels, and so on. So, okay, what is the biggest, what is the most likely thing that's going to compromise athletic performance, energy levels? It's not necessarily the Ozempic per se. Of course, if there's and we are going to talk about this, but there's rapid calorie restriction and a poor quality diet, of course that's relevant. But the most likely thing that's going to affect someone's quality of life is the most likely negative symptom, which for GLP-1 medications has to do with gastrointestinal health. Okay. So I've been rambling on to give you a chance to read what's on the slide, but I'm going to go through each of these things. Now, by the way, what I will tell you, and actually I'm going to inject a few more points for some of these aspects, right? So eat small, frequent meals and eat slowly. I think on some level that's obvious. If appetite is reduced, that large meals may no longer be in the question. Now, eating slowly is a very interesting point. So I want to come back to this for a moment. So for those who don't know, and I mentioned this earlier, that first of all, eating slowly and mindfully will reduce the blood sugar effect of a meal. Okay. It will also lead to a more optimal response of appetite hormones, which will make you more full more quickly. So technically speaking, mindful eating could have a synergistic effect with Ozempic in terms of appetite management. And that could be valuable in those maybe who need to use a lower dose, who don't get that super strong suppression, but they still want to use the medication. So I'm trying to I'm trying to offer the Ozempic case here when I make that point. Okay. So obviously, avoiding overly spicy and seasoned foods, that's going to be helpful as well. Avoiding consuming liquid foods like soups and broths during the evening meal, as they may slow down digestion, increase symptoms. Stay hydrated by drinking water in small sips, avoiding excessive water intake during meals. I think that's a point that would be probably universally useful for people because not everybody will associate mealtime with not drinking, and some people will. Okay. Definitely avoid lying down right after eating. I mean, again, acid reflux is a common occurrence in many people, and one of the reasons why it can occur is that when people eat a meal and they recline shortly after, well, gravity in your digestive system are no longer working in the same direction, so it puts you in a more vulnerable position to experience those symptoms. Okay, so some of this advice, avoid wearing very tight clothing and so on, and obviously, if the symptoms are unbearable, that it's time to consult a doctor. And should we encounter someone who for whom they express that would be the best advice. Okay, because one of the really important things to know is that when we talk about success with this medication, the level of interaction with the healthcare provider is one of the big indicators of success. So when you look at intelligent people, anti-obesity doctors, researchers, and they look at the data and they speak about the patient experience, the point that comes up time and time again is close communication with the healthcare team. So whether that is a dietitian, the trainer, or the doctor, people who have that kind of circle, that community, do much better on this medication, right? And so that's a point of advocacy, I think, for everyone here, and also a point to remind everyone here of their importance, and that our roles are not being replaced at all with the inclusion of this medication. And as we'll see as I carry on this conversation, if anything, our roles are probably more important than they've ever been, I think, if you want to take the optimist viewpoint. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the synergy of Ozempic, GLP-1 medications with physical activity. So what this slide indicates, and it's kind of what I said earlier, is that, in a perfect world, we are aiming for 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week. Okay. Now, this particular study also allowed for 75 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity. So, what's the difference between that? Well, one of them is, 5 30-minute, we're talking about aerobic activity in this moment. Okay. 5 30-minute runs versus five 15-minute hit workouts on a bicycle, right? Almost fell off my chair there. Okay, so basically, long story short, this study found that the combination of physical activity and GLP-1 medication led to better improvements in all relevant aspects of outcomes of interest, which include bodily inflammation, aspects of metabolic syndrome like A1C and blood sugar levels, and obviously, visceral fat and fat around the midsection as well. So this particular study doesn't offer an earth-shattering point, but what it does is it hammers home the synergy that you'll do better exercising with this medication than not, even if your only goal is around, well, I say even if, as if these goals aren't important, even if the goals are just around reducing blood sugar or reducing triglycerides or things of that nature. Okay. So this is one of many examples of the synergy, and we're going to actually carry that example forward. Okay. So this is a paper from Lancet, right? A very famous scientific journal. Again, so here's the interesting thing. All of the best, and this is gonna come out very soon, but the best studies looking at combining GLP-1s and physical activity, ironically, all look at aerobic activity. Okay. Perhaps because that's more accessible for large populations. I actually don't know the precise justification. So the best studies actually look at aerobic activity combined with GLP-1s. So let's read through this slide because this is very, very fascinating stuff. Okay. People who receive both supervised exercise training and a GLP-1 medication had a 4 times higher chance of maintaining that 10% weight loss. So I discussed that 10% weight loss number earlier. Okay. 10% weight loss 1 year after medication termination than those receiving the GLP-1 medication alone. Okay. So I forgot to add the one piece of important context. This study looks at people who go off of the medication, okay, for a year, right? So basically, this is another story for us to be aware of and for us to tell our clients that. So if we have an individual and maybe in their head, their ultimate goal is to be off of the medication, their success rate to maintain their weight loss on the medication is 4 times higher if they have an exercise program in tow, right, as part of the process. So again, just that, for what that's worth. I mean, this is worth a lot, right? That's a very big deal. 4 times higher likelihood to maintain weight loss if they combine exercise with the medication. Okay. That is due to, and there's a number of factors for that, which I think are going to be pretty obvious. Okay. So let's look at what happens in these different scenarios. Okay. So weight regain after terminating GLP-1 medication, 6 kilograms more, almost 15 pounds more, okay, than those who just got supervised exercise. Okay. So if you compare people who got just GLP-1s or just exercise, okay, 1 year after they stopped one or the other, people who just got the GLP-1s gained way more weight back. Okay. That's number one. Okay. The next point, weight regain after terminating GLP-1 medication was 2 kilograms more than those who received the combination. Okay. So people who received both medications, and I will slip off my chair again. Okay. People who receive both medications, both the medication and the physical activity. Okay. Actually, wait, give me one moment. Weight regain after, I want to make sure I have this point right. Okay. You know what? I may have mixed up the numbers. Basically, the point of the slide is to say that people who combine exercise with GLP-1s, their success rate is much higher. They don't regain as much weight. I think I may have confused the bigger number and the smaller number, but I think we get the point here is that when physical activity and GLP-1 medications are prescribed, even if the goal is to come off the medication, people who are physically active during the medication process are vastly more successful at keeping their weight off. Okay. So, why is that important? Well, we'll imagine the individual. Sorry, I keep on falling off of my chair, probably due to the excitement of this sharing the information. But so imagine the individual that you're speaking with, who maybe they think they're going to use this medication, and that as such, it discounts the value of physical activity in their life, and that's something that, of course, everyone in this audience would not agree with and certainly not abide by. So we have actually real hard evidence that the long-term outcomes of people who go down that path, if their ultimate goal, especially, is to stop using the medication, it's really not great. Okay, so that's a big win on the side of physical activity, and I want to offer this study here. We go back to the effect of GLP-1s on how the beta cells of the pancreas work and how effectively they release insulin. Well, what this study found is one of the reasons why physical activity and the GLP-1s work well together is they have a synergistic effect with how well the beta cells of the pancreas work, which is to say, more optimally release insulin to be more, and ultimately to provide a higher level of insulin sensitivity throughout the body. There's a synergy here between exercise and GLP-1 medications in terms of how they affect the pancreas functionality and insulin sensitivity in the body, which then explains partially why there's a synergy in the outcomes that we see when people combine both together. Okay. Now you'll notice, as I mentioned, a lot of this so far, we're seeing the word aerobic training a lot, right? Because this is the majority of the studies that are taking place, focusing on aerobic training. So now, of course, we have to talk about muscle mass. Okay. And again, there are different studies that have been done in this regard. I'm going to share one out of the Lancet, which is one of the most, acclaimed, reputable scientific journals. And this is very good data. So what they found is over a year and a half period, muscle loss, lean mass loss could have been as high as 40%. Okay. In this particular study, it was as low as 25%. So that's obviously, a significant portion of weight lost while on Ozempic has the potential to be muscle loss. Okay. Now, what are the reasons? Well, there are multiple reasons for this, and I'm going to actually talk about that shortly. But to give a sense of it, inevitably, rapid weight loss is not ideal for retaining muscle mass. Okay. So obviously, this creates a conundrum where we have to think about, are we doing resistance training? Are we eating enough protein? Is the weight loss rate too quick? Okay. There's all sorts of factors involved there, right? So if we take a jump down, okay, to the third point, we see weight loss due to calorie restriction without medication was a little bit lower. Okay. The reason is primarily is because the rate of loss is obviously likely to be higher when you have a GLP-1 medication in tow. So it would be unfair to say that Ozempic is a unique cause of muscle loss per se, but by virtue of its potential to lead to rapid weight loss, it can lead to undesirable amounts of muscle loss. Okay. And as far as I'm aware, there are no high-level studies that I've looked at how a robust exercise training routine can mitigate that loss, right? But those are inevitably coming, and that doesn't stop us from talking about this topic in different ways. So which is what we're going to do. So a big question that's inevitable is how much protein, right? How much protein do we need if we're on Ozempic to mitigate the effect of muscle loss, right? So this is a study that's not necessarily based on Ozempic, but it's based on retaining muscle mass in the context of weight loss. Okay, right? And what we have here is a number which is a minimum of 1.3 grams per kilograms per day, which from a dietitian perspective, I think is a functional minimum in terms of offering guidance for protein requirements in the context of Ozempic. One can certainly go higher, and there's a lot of range for variability here depending on the individual, right? One of the biggest challenges, I think, from the nutrition perspective, which one will encounter, is that, okay, calorie intake is decreasing. The importance of protein's always important, let's be honest, but the importance of protein probably increases, right? But then also we have this massive challenge where we also have to accommodate and allow for a diverse, high quality diet. So to the extent to which appetite and calorie intake have decreased, that is where maybe we decide the exact amount of protein we can offer. If someone has to make a massive amount of sacrifices to the quality of their diet to get 1.8, 1.9, 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, then you have to question whether or not that's worth it. So as a hard minimum, and certainly higher than this is acceptable, as a hard minimum, I would probably say 1.3 grams per kilogram a day in terms of protein intake, okay, in this context. Now, here are a few quotes from a paper out of the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine. And these are quotes from thought leaders in this field that I found would be interesting. So I'm going to read them out. Okay. Now, to be fair, not all of these quotes are fully substantiated by data. These are more like philosophical clips by people who are, high level in this space. So most patients who start GLP-1 medications will discontinue use, and without meaningful behavior change, there's a high probability of weight regain. Lifestyle and mindset changes are vital for GLP-1 patients. Okay, so I actually substantiated this particular statement in an earlier slide where I demonstrated that the outcomes are way better when you combine physical activity with GLP-1, which is what meaningful behavior change is, right? So lifestyle and mindset changes are vital for GLP-1 patients. And you know, I think that's incumbent upon all of us who are healthcare practitioners and interacting with people on these medications to, instill this aspect that yes, you're taking this medication. Yes, it has a certain probability of success for this outcome of interest for you, but it does not take away from all these other things that are important. And I think we have responsibility to the best of our ability through charisma, through rapport building, and so on to ensure that people don't fall into the trap thinking that I'm going to take this medication, ride off into the sunset, and that these other factors like diet and exercise are no longer important. Because we all know that's not the case. And to some extent, we don't need data to show us that because that's true of any context. That diet and exercise are very important, right? Okay, next quote. Interviews and other feedback show that those who regularly did strength training and ate enough protein were more likely to keep their muscle and strength. Okay, so that's not a surprise at all, right? So this is essentially a quote based on qualitative interviewing of people on these medications, right? Because there's not been, to my knowledge, a high level study done where robust resistance training was used in concert with Ozempic, but we do have an accumulation of anecdotal evidence, and obviously we have a broad understanding of what happens when you lose weight rapidly if you don't do strength training. What's going to happen, right? So again, as much as GLP-1 medications are unique, the ultimate output in terms of weight is rapid weight loss. So what we're really protecting against, besides the GI symptoms, is protecting against the negative influence of rapid weight loss, right? Which is muscle loss, potentially low energy due to compromised caloric intake. So a big question, and certainly one of the questions that was put forward to me in terms of preparing this presentation was, does GLP-1 medication reduce energy levels or fatigue? And that is not explicitly a common symptom. So it's not to say that GLP-1s induce fatigue. However, if you have an individual on a GLP-1 medication who doesn't have an appropriate strategy in hand from the nutrition perspective, they could be at risk for experiencing fatigue if their diet quality drops remarkably, or certainly that their diet quantity, in terms of the quantity they eat, drops remarkably, and they don't have an advanced strategy in order to check all their boxes. Because, I think it's true that the more calories an individual has to work with, the easier it is, even accidentally, for us to hit our nutrition needs. The less calories we have to work with, the more each singular choice matters when it comes to optimizing nutrition, right? And I think that's a very important message for me to get across to everyone here today. And yeah, again, I'm going to read one more quote, okay? Factors such as self-reported protein intake, medication adherence, and regular follow-up contribute to success. So this is what I alluded to earlier, okay? People who are explicitly pursuing a higher protein diet, who are paying attention to using the medication properly, which by the way involves communication with their doctor, right? And who regularly follow up, right? And that goes not only for their doctor, right, but for other members of their healthcare team. So I'm trying to offer, these are the most effective messages and the most effective behaviors in people using these medications, right? Because if we understand this and we transmit this, and again, we're not here to make a judgment call on whether someone should use GLP-1 medications or not. We're here to provide the best support we can in those who are using them. So when that is the question at hand, this is the context, this is the information that is very valuable for us to know and for us to transmit to those who we're working with. Okay. So essentially, this is just more broadly speaking about all the different reasons why people lose muscle when they're on Ozempic, okay, or when they're on GLP-1 medications. Okay, so we're gonna go through them. Some of these I've already covered pretty well, but okay, first of all, I'm gonna go counterclockwise. Gastrointestinal side effects. Exactly what I said earlier. It's obvious the case is that if someone is dealing with above average GI symptoms, that is going to negatively influence their ability to do the things they want to do on the diet exercise front. So this is very important that, you know, that people understand the steps they can take, which I did provide in the slide earlier, to mitigate those symptoms. Okay. Obviously, reduction in appetite, potential aversion to certain foods, right? Now, there actually, so, and you know, there was a survey data from the Dalhousie survey. So I was saving it for this moment, okay? So in the Dalhousie survey, they asked people, which foods are you cutting down on the most on Ozempic? This is really fascinating, okay? The majority of the foods that they reported were kind of the traditional foods, which are not, let's say to say diplomatically, which were not particularly nutrient dense, okay? I think we understand what I mean when I say that. Now, one of the foods on the list was meat. Okay, 25% of respondents said that they cut down their meat intake as a result of Ozempic use. That is where the food aversion aspect comes in. So now we see a very unique context where we have potentially a higher protein need, we have a lower appetite, and a potential aversion to a major protein source. Okay, so I don't have a broad solution, a magic thing I could just, but this is what I mean when we talk about individualization, individual inquiry, when it comes to really success rates with this medication. This is some of the reasons why, right? Obviously, the next answer, of course, is an inadequate protein intake, calorie reduction. Obviously, you know, an individual taking Ozempic, you know, they could also potentially, on average, be slightly older. So there's age-related muscle loss that we might expect as well, right? And also, again, pre-existing low muscle mass. Because I suppose there is a case to be made, which is a fair case, that an individual who is more likely to pursue Ozempic use, on the whole, on the average, they may have a below average amount of muscle to begin with. So then the plot thickens even further, right, as we kind of build this out, right? And of course, people may have other challenges like type 2 diabetes, which can influence their energy levels, their desire to do certain things, depending on how well it's managed, right? So this is the totality of the picture. And the reason why this is important is because it's not just like, oh, it's not just enough to carte blanche say, oh yeah, GLP-1s cause muscle loss and that's it, right? There are multifaceted reasons for why that is, and the precise reasons that affect different people will be different. So these are the things you want to look out for. Okay, I think that's the value of this particular slide. Okay, so another key point, right? And I kind of allude to this numerous times today, is we have a great deal to learn, okay, about Ozempic use in terms of how does it interact with working with other health professionals? How does it interact with working with resistance training? Okay, how does it interact at different protein levels? Right? It'd be lovely to have a study. Let's put two people on Ozempic. One person is getting 1 gram of protein per kilogram. One person is getting 2 grams of protein per kilogram. What is the difference in muscle mass? We don't have that study right now, but that's the kind of study that'd be very fascinating for us to really quantify the difference, right, that protein intake would make. But we don't have all the answers. And I actually would encourage everyone here to be very wary about anyone who tries to provide all the answers or acts like they have all the answers in this area. Okay, because there's a lot of studies that have not been done yet, right? So when someone puts forward a special workout routine for people on GLP-1 medications, well, that's very fascinating because to my knowledge, there is no specially curated GLP-1 workout routine that's been scientifically rigorously tested for a specific unique effect. Okay, so we have to be very mindful about people who oversell their solutions for people on these medications. So I want to read a few things in this particular graphic because I found them very interesting. Okay. So first point, okay, and this is this is a study which aggregated other studies and commented on them just for context, okay? So in 10 studies looking at GLP-1 use, okay, the average calorie intake reduction was between 16 to 39%. Okay, so that's the amount of calorie intake that is generally being reduced on people who are using Ozempic. Now, let's do a little experiment here, okay? So someone's eating, let's just say we have an individual who eats 2,000 calories a day, and that we went up. The example I'm going to provide is very specific, so it doesn't exist in real life. But let's say they're eating 2,000 calories a day, and let's just imagine, okay, in the normal course of interaction, hey, maybe go on a 250 calorie deficit. You're maintaining your weight here. Let's try a 250 calorie deficit for you. Okay, I'm just throwing that number out. Okay, so if we look at a 40%, let's actually call it a 33% reduction because my mental math is not that good. Okay, so that's going to be, what is that going to be? 650 calorie reduction, right, from Ozempic use. So you can see the magnitude of caloric reduction is very large, potentially, on Ozempic. So again, we have to be mindful of that, right? It's not magic per se, and we know this, to be fair, but it's a massive caloric reduction above and beyond, let's say, what we might institute as a modest caloric deficit if, like, I'm a dietitian working with a client. Okay, so this shapes the context really heavily. It's very important. Now, fascinatingly enough, only 2 of the 10 studies in this research review actually had a dietitian involved in the process, right? So that could completely change the outcome, right? Having a dietitian involved with customized guidance, optimizing the diet, the protein levels, there's a massive potential for that to totally change the outcome. But that's not been the case in a lot of these studies. So we're not sure yet how to magnify, or sorry, how to quantify, that's the word I'm looking for, how to quantify that effect, right? And again, only 4 studies evaluated changes in macronutrient intake in addition to changes in energy intake, right? So there's a lot of disparity in the studies. There's not a universal look at certain outcomes, okay? So some of the questions that are unanswered, I want to read these out, okay? How does the use of GLP-1 medications impact eating patterns, and how does it influence our macro and micronutrient intakes? We don't have high-level data on that yet. So that's something that we have to look at on the individual level. So we don't know, when someone takes Ozempic, does their iron intake go down? You know, very well, I mean, we likely could speculate that if their meat intake goes down, it does, but we don't necessarily have the ability to quantify that yet, right? And again, the question I actually posed earlier, the theoretical question, what happens if someone eats more or less protein on Ozempic? How does that influence the change in their body? That's a question that still needs to be answered. And also to optimize the dietary advice for people with GLP-1 medications. Although I think dietitians are going to be pretty well versed to handle that, although more data in this area will help us do that better. So these are some unanswered areas that I think are worth being aware of. Okay, now we need to talk bone health. Okay, now, again, the most important message here, and it is pretty much that, we all have some sense that, like, weight bearing activities have the potential to maintain bone mass as we age. Okay, whether that's resistance training or activities that involve us bouncing around, running, and so on. This study showed one important thing, which is that bone loss was significantly, bone mineral density, the reduction in bone mineral density was much less, right, when people combine exercise with GLP-1 use. Okay, so this is just real data, and again, it's important to know that it's exercise, and I guess part of my role today is to really, again, I think I said at the beginning, our roles are probably more important in the context of this medication use. And I didn't want to just say that willy-nilly, and hopefully I'm doing a good job of substantiating that claim. So we see here in this study that exercise combined with GLP-1 use does statistically significantly mitigate the negative effect of GLP-1 medication on bone loss, right? Now, what is the massive long-term effect of GLP-1 medication on bone loss? It's hard to say. What I would speculate as a dietitian is that if you have an individual who's getting customized care and is doing physical activity, this individual, I think, is going to be quite well protected against negative outcomes like bone and muscle loss while using GLP-1 medications, right? To the extent at which that's fully true, the future will tell us more. But I think the biggest risk, as it always is using this medication with no other support. I think that is where challenges can arise, especially in the long term, right? Because when we use this medication, the weight loss is one topic of interest, but there's a lot of other topics of interest like muscle loss, like bone loss, right? So it also depends at the lens in which we look at the outcome, right? I want to pause on this for a moment because the study I showed earlier talking about the benefits versus harms, that was based on the goal of weight loss being the primary definition of benefit. But what if we expand that definition to include other things? Then the equation could change a little bit, right? So this is a little bit philosophical. There are people who are, more pharmaceutically inclined and more in the space than me who maybe have a different take on what I've just said. But I think scientifically what I said is valid, and certainly hopefully it piques interest and some thoughts in all of us today. I want to offer this study as well, which basically found that from the nutrition perspective, that Mediterranean diet was very effective at mitigating bone loss in older women. Okay. Um, as we kind of look to a dietary approach to, to think about for people taking GLP-1 medications or more broadly. Now, I mean, how I would, I'll briefly comment on the Mediterranean diet, and then we're going to talk about bone health and dietary patterns. Like, I mean, the Mediterranean diet for the most part is essentially asking people to consume maybe a little bit more nuts and beans and fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and maybe diversify their protein intake, right? To not only be red meat or poultry, or but to also to include fish and seafood and so on. Like, that's for the most part, that's what the Mediterranean diet is offering now. By the way, when we look at nutrient patterns related to osteoporosis, well, fish is the highest dietary source of vitamin D, right? Vitamin D we know is important for bone health. Fruits and vegetables, obviously important source of vitamin K. Also, certain vegetables are a good source of calcium in addition to milk. Obviously, cow's milk and cow's milk related products are a very good source of calcium. There's no getting around that. Very useful foods. And that's maybe one area where even the Mediterranean diet maybe says to have not a huge amount of those things. I don't necessarily agree that's the best course of action in that particular case. But eating enough fruits and vegetables offers vitamin K, antioxidants, right? So we want to be careful not to omit these things, or not to have people omit these things as they pursue, dietary changes as it relates to Ozempic, especially in this day and age. I was going to make a further point to that. Actually, no, I think that's fine for this point. Just to keep these things in mind. Like, these are some of the nutrients that are really important for reducing osteoporosis risk. It's not just about calcium, right? Although calcium obviously is very important. I'll teach everyone a fun fact that I saw a study recently that kale, and I'm a big fan of kale. And obviously, kale is a massive source of vitamin K, which is very good for the bones, and magnesium, which is also important for bone health. Kale has less calcium than cow's milk, but the calcium in kale is actually more readily absorbed, which is kind of a surprising finding, I think, just instinctually. But it does seem to be the case in laboratory studies that the calcium in kale is better absorbed. Kale is very low oxidant, by the way, compared to things like spinach, for those who are interested in that kind of subtopic. So I'll just throw that out there.
Andy, thank you again so very much for being with us today. We appreciate you. The chat has been on fire with comments saying thank you and how great this information is. So we do want to express our gratitude to you for the time that you spent with us today.